evening. Welcome to another edition of the Press Club with me, Kendall Burton, and Mr. Earl Bousquet. We'll review big stories making news each and every week, locally, regionally, internationally, as well as discuss issues affecting the media and the day's newspapers. We'll start with the Mirror newspaper today. Welcome Harry. PM Shastny makes a plea to tackle climate change. The Star newspaper, Lucians welcome Prince Harry. And what about human traffickers in our midst? And of course, we have the Voice newspaper, all about trade. St. Lucia and Taiwan display their goods, and Prince Harry's brief visit. Not deserving of the spread that the Star and the Mirror gave it. Equally brief story on the front page of the Voice newspaper. And of course, we have the regular inserts from the Voice newspaper. The Yo magazine, Jeshurun heads for the top, and the Tonight magazine, as well as the Sports and Health magazine from the Star newspaper, looking at the recently held Flotilla Observed ARC 2016, which marked the launch of the 2016 edition of the Atlantic Rally for Cruisers, the first participant in which is expected to arrive here on Monday, breaking another ARC record in 2016. But apart from that, what big stories stuck out in your mind this week? Of course, I imagine the passing of Fidel Castro would be one, if not the big story. News having broke of his passing on Friday night about 10:29 p.m. in Cuba. Plans, most of Cuba, I believe, is in mourning. We see on CNN this morning a lot of celebration, especially in Florida, where there's a large Cuban population reacting to his death. But as you mull over his life, what is the legacy you think that Fidel Castro is leaving behind?
I think the legacy of Fidel is he leaves a long legacy with many tentacles. He is perhaps the single longest lasting, most widely known world leader, not just a leader of Cuba and Latin America and the Caribbean, world leader. I think his influence over his 55 years in politics or as leader of Cuba following the revolution went beyond the shores of Cuba into as far as Africa and as close as the Caribbean. He was revered in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the entire world. That's one legacy. Another legacy which will be unsurpassed in our lifetime is that he survived 11 U.S. presidents, from President Eisenhower all the way up to President Bill Clinton, and he was alive to see the first U.S. president.
Technically, you can say 12.
Yeah, over to see Obama visit Cuba. He was not too happy about it, and he made his views quite clear, including that he didn't think his younger brother went far enough in ensuring that the conditions for a visit by a U.S. president were tied closer to the lifting of the embargo. Another very strong legacy of his will be what he left the world in health and education in Cuba, because Cuba's education system was one in which, irrespective of the embargo, irrespective of Cuba's economic position, he always ensured, up until today, his legacy is that every developing country in the world with students who cannot afford education are given that opportunity for a free education in Cuba. And also sending Cuban teachers and brigades to teach everything from literacy in Haiti and Grenada to African states, Angola, all of the liberated states, most countries that won their liberation through armed struggle or by the ballot. He always ensured that Cuba's solidarity was not money, but the value. And the value of education is one. And we know quite well what that has meant for us in terms of the hundreds of St. Lucians who have studied everything from medicine to engineering, everything in Cuba. Also on the health stage. Cuba continues to be praised by the World Health Organization as the country with the most advanced standards in certain areas of health, to the extent that one of the things I heard being recalled by a journalist on BBC within hours after his death was that they were amazed at the fact that you look at people of wealth, when they fall sick, they tend to go to Cuba, whether it was Diego Maradona, presidents, heads of state, because the Cuban health system is so good, despite it being held back by the inability to source anything to do with it as a result of the blockade. The United Nations, through the World Health Organization, point to Cuba as the best in child health. They've been able to discover cures for a number of diseases. And fortunately, I think Fidel would have been happy to have seen and heard that at the 25th annual consecutive presentation of the resolution of the United Nations to lift the U.S. blockade, which is over 55 years old, that on this 25th time, Cuba did not vote against. United States did not vote against, but abstained. And that is very significant in terms of, while Obama was not allowed to deliver on anything like the lifting of the blockade, he did, poke Uncle Sam in the eye and say, listen, we have to reopen our bridges to Cuba. He stood up to the Congress. He stood up to everything. And I think that is something that Fidel would have even silently admired.
But what happens now, because you have a new president, or a president-elect, who's going to come into power, or be sworn in officially in January 20th, who has said during the campaign that one of the first things that he's going to do is dismantle everything that Obama did, especially as it relates to Cuba, unless Cuba, according to him, meets our demands. And I'm quoting him, not my demands, but our demands for freedom of religion in Cuba, release of prisoners, and so on and so forth. How do you see that playing out? How do you see it playing out in Cuba itself now, where you have, Fidel Castro has been spoken about as one of the most divisive figures in his recent history, to the point where his own children are divided in how they see him. Some respect and adore him, and others distance themselves and want nothing to do with him. You take that and you apply it to the Cuban population in Cuba. How do you see it playing out? A lot of people have been described as holding him up, looking at him as a father figure that they respect and fear, even though they don't agree with his policies and his approaches to his administration of the country.
Okay, three things. Donald Trump, I think, is going to have more serious problems on his hands than looking to undo what Obama did with regard to Cuba. He's got the Russians to deal with, he's got the Chinese to deal with, he's got the Mexicans to deal with, he's got NATO to deal with. I'm not saying that Cuba is not going to, is not important on his team. We've also heard Trump beginning to undo and unsay a number of the campaign things now that he has to deal with policy. He's reaching out to his enemies, people who were prepared to, people who he's reaching out to his enemies in terms of the people he's appointing. So let's wait and see on that one. Insofar as Cuba is concerned, we have to remember that Fidel has been out of public life for 10 years. Cubans have they have accepted that while he is the eternal commander-in-chief, leader, president for life, he is no longer in charge. And that came out quite clearly when Obama visited, where he was saying, I don't agree with what my brother and my government has done, but, they are the ones in charge. So I do not think you're going to, his death is going to result in any change in the status quo in Cuba. The party is strong in the, among people. It has support. If anything, Fidel were to have been done, it would have been done when he was relegated to sickness and so on. Thirdly, in terms of, the last one was,
We'll discuss that when we come back. We're due for a break. We'll take the break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation looking at the aftermath of Fidel Castro's passing and what it likely means for Cuba and the rest of the region. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the passing of the Cuban president, Fidel Castro, and what that likely means for the future of Cuba. You're talking about the fact that Cubans have accepted that for the last 10 years he hasn't been. But I don't know to what degree is that true. While he may not have been in power, you have to ask yourself how much influence he had over his brother Raul. Because even Raul has said that he's going to step down in 2018, but he's already picked a successor who is one of the hardline Communist Party members. So
well,
do you see the continuation of the Castro legacy for that?
It's not just the Castro, it's not the Castro, well, the Castro legacy, but we have to understand, and that is what has been used during the Cold War to condition people's understanding of the reality in Cuba. Cuba was the first country in 1959 to establish a one-party state in this part of the world, the Western Hemisphere. Cuba was an active founding member of the non-aligned movement when the West said it was totally aligned to the Soviet Union. Cuba became the leading, it was the first country in the world to poke its eye into Uncle Sam's, its finger into Uncle Sam's eye from 90 miles away. That brought the ire and the agony and the rage expected from the United States, but it also won a lot of admiration for Fidel, even from people who did not support his politics. And that was one of the very important things that worked for him, because he said what a lot of people thought but were unable to say. He said at the UN on behalf of all developing countries exactly what they wanted to say but couldn't say. And he lived, he built Cuba in a way, and there's one thing we have to understand, Kendall, that people cannot be dictated to forever. Whenever a people get the opportunity to rise, they rise. Whenever people can no longer take it, they rise. I do not see demonstrations taking place in Cuba in support of you know, like what's happening in Miami. The big bad dog is dead. It's not going to happen. But
maybe reality hasn't hit yet, because remember, they don't have the internet access that a lot of us
no.
do.
It was announced. It was announced on radio and TV from midnight. Raul Castro from midnight last night made a official state address that his brother had died. Well, that
but according to CNN reports, a lot of people were still going and pounding on his half brother's door, asking, "Is it true?" The rumors of his death have been around for years.
One of the things he has done to avoid all of the big chaos over his death is that he willed that he be cremated the day after his death. So he was cremated today, because he precisely didn't want to have a big, funeral of people. He had said and written elsewhere that he would have wanted to be buried in the Sierra Maestra, the mountains where they started the struggle. His powder or his ashes might be spread there. But the reality is that he was a head of state, and there are things you cannot get away from when you have held that position. So he is going to have a state funeral where heads of government are going to go to Cuba and pay their tributes until or unless he specifically said in his will that he doesn't want that. But even that is not something, when you're dead, you're dead. When you die as a head of state, you're still a property of the state. And therefore, you do not deny those who would want to pay tribute to one of the greatest leaders the world has known the opportunity to do so. So I can foresee they may, innovatively rename it into a tribute, or instead of a funeral. I've seen the same happen with Chavez, that, you know, he's honored on the anniversary of his death every year, but more in terms of what he meant while he was alive, and not from the standpoint of what Venezuela is missing now that he's dead. And coming to anniversary dates, we can shift a bit. Today is yesterday was November the 25th, and November the 25th has been designated since 1975, I think, as the day, again, United Nations designated World Day Against Violence Against Women. And interestingly, I mean, between the 1st of January and the 25th of November this year, I mean, hardly a week has passed without us hearing some complaint against sexual violence, violence against women, etc., etc. And it beats me that this morning when I went through the papers, I'd like to be proven wrong, but I hadn't seen anything about the fact that, you know, yesterday was International Day Against Violence.
You're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, I think International Men's Day got more coverage this year around than Women's Day Against Women's Violence.
What does that say to you?
What does it say to you? I don't know.
Not much. What it says to me is that there's a very distinct possibility, until and unless things change, that November 25th will be known more as the day, the anniversary of Castro's death, than the day to sharpen the call and increase the call and demand for an end to violence against women, which is something that's not going to
I certainly don't think that it means that we have made headway in terms of resolving those issues that are brought up at that time every year.
I doubt it. We haven't resolved the issues. We haven't resolved the issues.
Perhaps we were distracted by the arrival of Prince Harry, which is another issue that perhaps we can discuss.
How do you see Prince Harry's visit? Is this the first royal visit that you would have? Which was the last you saw?
You know, I don't remember. I have never paid attention to the royal visits of any kind, whether it's here or on the other islands in the region, as Prince Harry has been touring a number of countries, Antigua included, which seems to have been making a lot of international headlines for all the wrong reasons, including the Prime Minister's comments to him about his relationship, which has been a contentious issue between Prince Harry and the media in the UK, where he has asked the media to back off. And then you had the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda suggesting that there was a new princess in the offing, and that Prince Harry and his new bride should consider moving to Antigua or having their honeymoon in Antigua. You know, but it went further, you know, when the prince was surrounded by some half-naked models, you know, and the Prime Minister went further and suggested that, you know, whatever happens in Antigua and Barbuda, like in Vegas, should stay in Antigua and Barbuda. A reference made at the back of the Star newspaper, by the way, where it says, everyone knows whatever leaves St. Lucia never happened in St. Lucia, and Harry was safe here. And then you had another incident shortly afterwards where a performer in Antigua was trying to get the prince to dance with her, and he kept declining very diplomatically, and she kept insisting until he had to prod the Prime Minister to take over, which he did. But when we come back, as we do for a break, we can talk about how perhaps some other St. Lucians, including yourself, saw the visit and what likely is to come out of it.
Sure.
We're due for a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Prince Harry's visit. Looking at the Star headline, Lucians welcome Prince Harry. To what degree do you think St. Lucians even cared that the prince was there?
Well, I returned home on a Friday afternoon from Chile, and on my way to Castries from Beaufort, I encountered the Royal Cavalcade going down to the DSH project, and there weren't 10 vehicles. I mean, including security. There were not 10 vehicles. I did not see people lining the streets with British flags and St. Lucian flags like he would have had to do for his grandmother. I think the people are more concerned today about day-to-day things than paying reference or reverence to royalty. I don't know what sort of crowd the cricket match had at Beausejour. That would have been a good yardstick insofar as the interest people would pay. And the British would understand that after 37, 38 years of independence, we cannot be expected to be, bowing to the Union Jack. These visits are simply part of a tradition that I can tell may soon disappear, because these visits are annual visits required for the Queen to visit her kingdom or her queendom. And since she cannot, visit all of the countries that fall under the Commonwealth, because while St. Lucia and the countries being visited by Harry are no longer colonies, they are still, she's still our queen based on our membership of the Commonwealth. It still churns some of us to hear our MPs paying reverence to Her Majesty at the beginning of every meeting of the House of Assembly or the Senate. But that is, is that sort of contradiction that results in us having to go overboard, to spend what we don't have, do what we don't normally do for ourselves, to pay reverence to the representative of an empire which we today are calling upon to pay reparations.
Yeah, but talking about reparations, how do you account for that mentality, that desire to latch on and to remain affiliated with an empire or power like that has done or been accused of doing what the British have? For instance, look at Canada, for instance. They achieved independence in 1867, but up until 1987 or 86, they were still in effect, serving the British, paying reverence to the Queen, etc. It wasn't until then that she gave them, full constitutional and other independence, but a lot of the indigenous people suffered as a result of British. How do you account for that mentality?
That points to the power of the imperial dictate. The way they designed colonialism, the way they designed the constitutional structures for the colonies was, remember, that we didn't fight for the independence. We didn't go through battle.
True.
We negotiated, and in negotiating, we were negotiating as from the lower standpoint, quote unquote, as the colony begging to let go of our colonial mother's skirt. So we had to negotiate our freedom from Britain, and in that negotiation they gave us a constitution that requires that the Queen continue to be our head of state, that required that we don't ask them for nothing more than the 52 million pounds that they gave us, that required that we pay reverence and honor to the Queen at every parliament, and that ensured that even if we become a republic like Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and soon to be Barbados, we will still have to be paying reverence to the Queen because you're part of the Commonwealth. No British colony that I know of, former British colony I know of, has pulled out of the Commonwealth. So I think until you have a generational change in terms of the leadership, in terms of the thinking, because we're still unfortunately at a situation where the judiciary, the people who run for elections, the people who win the doctor politics is still such that all of our lawyers, well, not all, but most, 90-something% of our lawyers are British trained. And British trained lawyers have that reverence for English law and that reverence for the monarchy that they will not easily admit, but which is reflected when you read what they write legally insofar and the addresses they make insofar as deep constitutional issues. They don't want to curse the Queen, But it'll say, if we could have, we would have been able to tell you in a polite way that, you should not have done this. So look at the problem we have to establish our own court Caribbean,
CCJ,
our Caribbean Court of Justice. The reason why we don't have a Caribbean Court of Justice yet is because the majority in our judiciary believe that we do not, and I'll put it blank, that black people don't have enough brains as white people. Black lawyers are not as good enough as judging black people as would be white people. That independence.
Yeah, but isn't that a little simplistic to say that, considering, I mean, would it not be a more practical or a more practical argument, for us not going that way, the way of the CCG as opposed to the Privy Council? The fact that the islands are small, there's concern about corruption, nepotism, and those valid reasons.
That's our business. We are independent states, and therefore, as a region or nationally, we have to deal and come up with justice systems that suit our culture. There are countries in Africa, in the Middle East, where the British and the US and Europe, the Western countries, are imposing sanctions against them on the basis of not accepting their cultural interpretation of life. Those who are against gay laws are told you can't get money. Those who engage in the brutality of stoning women who are accused of adultery. Yes, it is brutality, but in the society where it's happening, it is seen as part of a justice system. How do you go to tell those people, remove that, and we will give you some laws recognized by the Union, by the United Nations? So coming back to the Caribbean, I deliberately use the word black, because it figures there's a race element to do in it as well, from the standpoint of what the older members of the judiciary are saying, that they don't use the word black and white, but they're telling you that they have more confidence in the all-white Privy Council being able to give an independent view on something happening to us, by us, within us, than anyone among us, because their argument is that any single person in the Caribbean does not have the ability to be as independent as a member of the judicial, how you call it, the Privy Council.
It sounds to me like you're saying 6, I'm saying half a dozen, but we do for a break. We'll take it when we come back. We'll wrap up our conversation.
Half a glass.
Welcome back. As we say at the beginning of every show, this is also a show where we review issues affecting the media. This week, as you pointed out earlier, you were in Chile, attending a Chinese organized media summit, Latin American and the Caribbean Media Summit. What came out of that? We saw in the newspapers today that there was a call by the Chinese President Xi Jinping for more collaboration between Chinese and media personnel from Latin America and the Caribbean in coverage of Chinese involvement in that region. But beyond that, what else came out of that meeting?
Yeah, beyond that, what came out of it was that the Chinese have committed to continue to show concern about the level of coverage that China gets in Latin America and that Latin America gets in China, because they are pointing out that in 2016 you have a situation where only 5 Latin American countries have correspondents in China, and while China has about 20 offices around Latin America, but they represent only 5 Chinese media houses. And then you have the language and cultural difference where, yes, the Chinese are in Latin America, but they learn Spanish at school and they don't sufficiently understand the cultural and historical issues. And similarly, the Latin Americans in China don't speak Chinese, but they speak Spanish, and that limits their contact to only those Chinese who could understand Spanish, or they may have to go through the cost of having permanent translators. So bearing all of that in mind, 23 Chinese media houses were represented at the conference, and there were representatives from 24 Latin American and Caribbean countries. The meeting was hosted at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. And at the end of the 2 days, what was agreed, there were a number of things that were agreed, a number of proposals put on the table, and there were some agreements. The proposals include the need for there to be more frequent exchanges between journalists and media houses from Latin America and the Caribbean on the one hand, and China, and vice versa. But not just exchanges to go visit and to go observe how things are happening, but exchanges that are tied to how best they could come up with avenues for closer dialogue, working together, sharing of approaches. Secondly, the whole need, China is saying they are prepared to assist to make all of that happen by providing the IT wherewithal to upgrade platforms, create new platforms, introduce innovations that would enable Latin America and the Caribbean to share stories of common interest, rather than a continuation of a situation where the major stories are put in the daily news by the big multinational corporations that are also present in all of those countries, and the response is that China or Latin America would want to give their version of the story, but then that is a story that had been selected by persons and entities that have no interest in Latin America and the Caribbean or China, and our role would be to respond to that and try and give a positive version of a negative story. The idea is to turn that around by arming Chinese, Latin American and Caribbean journalists with the wherewithal to better understand the societies in which we're working, so that we can go and look for those stories that would introduce people to people, rather than be commenting about governments and politics. Not that that's not important, but the traditional multinational media houses, their coverage is mainly political, from a political standpoint, having to do with ideological and economic issues. I remember one guy saying that the private sector has been in charge of the press since the first printing machine was established, and this continues to be the case, where the private sector's interest in the media is different to that of state-owned media. But then the journalist, who has to choose between, or has no choice as to where he or she works, whether it is the private sector or with the public sector, there are certain things that we need to, certain tools we need to have, including people like me coming up to date with the technology today, including the need for, when you're being assigned to somewhere, to find the ways and means to get the stories that say something. And that was reflected in the ability of the Chinese media and some of the more the bigger media houses in Latin America to use the technology to introduce the citizen journalism approach, where young people, you know, you tie the news, the idea of news coverage and delivery to the use of smartphones, so that and tablets, so that the young people, that's where they take their news. And we who have grown up in the newspaper, radio and television industry, we need to understand that. In terms of agreements, it has been agreed that this is going to be an annual event where China, Latin America and Caribbean journalists will get together.
And I imagine it's going to be more important to have it now or have that kind of relationship, especially because the Chinese are becoming so much more invested and active in the region in terms of trade, trade increasing up to 2,000% from 2000 up to now, you know, and the Chinese have themselves said that while there's a lot of commerce happening, they're willing and interested in becoming more invested in the region. So that kind of relationship that you're talking about,
and that is where
critical.
we as a Caribbean have to be able to define our place in that, because trade between China and Latin America has multiplied 20 times in the past 10 years. To what extent, what are the figures in terms of China's trade with the Caribbean? You know,
there's another aspect I wanted to touch on before I run out of time. That is the U.S. security concern that Chinese are becoming more involved in Latin America and the Caribbean. You know where the relationship between those two states are or is.
Well, again, like I said, President Trump is going to have much more to do. He's going to be more concerned about his threat to pull out of the UN climate change talks and to cheer up the agreement that President Obama and Xi Jinping signed to bring America and China as the two biggest emitters of
greenhouse gases.
Yeah, so that I do not see, to answer that, I'd say that the US can jump, scream and bawl, but there's not much they will be able to do because China is today the #2 economy in the world, and they could easily be graduated as #1 if the economics is different in terms of the world's measure yardstick is GDP. If it was not GDP, and if you didn't have to add every single Chinese as part of that equation, then China would easily be the #1. And secondly, the US requires Chinese labor. I mean, Trump is talking about the increasing the tax of American goods done in Chinese or Mexican factories. That's not going to be good for the U.S. Treasury. So, you know, I think, again, the Chinese are very much aware of that. And what the biggest announcement coming out of that, which is going to really trouble the Americans, and I would challenge them to better it if they can, is that President Xi Jinping told us, the Latin American and Caribbean journalists, that over the next 5 years, he has committed to China inviting 500 journalists from Latin America and the Caribbean over the next 5 years.
Again, Mr. Bousquet, thanks for being here. Always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back here next week, hopefully, God willing. Until then, have yourselves a safe, enjoyable weekend, and we'll be back to talk to you next week.